me see where I am. Am I right?
You're right here.
Okay.
Now all I'm going to do is give the ground rules on how we're going to operate. And I'll introduce you and you'll introduce the low and low will introduce us.
Right, but I'm going to say that earlier this morning we did have the award ceremony and they made these awards, don't you think? Yes, sir.
Hey, Bob.
Yes, sir. You want to pay up there? I'll move. I'll move.
Your attention, please. The press conference is about to begin.
Jim, you want to sit? All right, well, we won't be quite ready, but we'll try. Bob Hart? Someone's going to
Yes, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Gemini 7-6 press conference. The ground rules today will be as follows. We'll have the Gemini 7 crew do a complete rundown of their mission from liftoff to splash, and then we'll have question and answers on that mission. Then we'll go into the 6th mission. We'll have question and answers immediately after that. During these 2 Q&A sessions, we'll go also to Berkeley and to Washington for question and answers from the press we have assembled at both of those places, at AAAS in Berkeley and the NASA headquarters in Washington. To begin this morning, I'd like to introduce the administrator of NASA, Mr. James E. Webb. Mr. Webb.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, friends, members of the press. Let me first announce that earlier at an awards ceremony in this auditorium with the families and other members of our NASA team present, the Distinguished Service Medal was awarded to astronaut Deke Slayton for his great job in training the crews that demonstrated their proficiency in Gemini 6 and 7 and all the preceding Gemini crews. This means that all 7 of the original astronauts now wear the Distinguished Service Medal of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Also, as an exception to the rule that we would award this highest medal only at the end of the Gemini series, we did make a second award to astronaut Walter Schirra for his tremendous show of personal courage under great danger and for thus making it possible to make the Rendezvous mission succeed at this time, which was very important. The Exceptional Service Medal was awarded to astronauts Stafford, Borman, Lovell, and Schirra for their outstanding performance. It is, next to the Distinguished Service Medal, the highest award we can make. The same was made to Mr. William C. Snyder and Mr. John T. Mingle, NASA's Exceptional Service Medal, and in recognition of the great job done by the industry, Air Force, NASA team in turning around and making the launches of the Titan succeed in spite of difficulties. Group Achievement Awards were made to Mr. G. Merritt Preston for the Launch Operations Group at the Kennedy Space Center, to Mr. Joseph M. Berlinder, Director of the Gemini Program for the Martin Company, for their group in the launch team, Mr. R.D. Hill, Base Manager, McDonnell Aircraft Corporation, Lieutenant Colonel John G. Alpert, Lieutenant Colonel Michael M. Kovac from the Air Force, Mr. John J. Williams representing the Kennedy Space Center itself. Now, it seems to me as we start this press conference and you have an opportunity to ask your questions of these men who have shown what it means to get the last 3 to 5% efficiency out of a man-machine combination, it is important to recognize that this demonstration permits much of what this nation is now doing and can do to show the world that we mean to use technology not to achieve power over other nations, but to develop power with them for peace and for the advance of the welfare of human beings all around the world. The importance of this, I believe, is that not only have we, in a sense, shown you, as Wallace Schirra mentioned this morning, that we can go from the old aeronautical terms like lift to drag to now new terms like torque to inertia, and do it very, very precisely, and do it before the eyes of hundreds of millions of people around the world who now do not have to accept an opinion by a scientist or an engineer or an administrator, but can say, I saw it myself. Also, it may be well to recognize that this flight not only shows the endurance of men and their capability in space, but shows further that we can now standardize the procedure for joining spacecraft, building whatever size spacecraft may be required, using either large or small rockets in orbit around the Earth. Now, it has never before been so clearly demonstrated how difficulties in such an operation can be overcome by good engineering and by the joining of good engineering in 20,000 companies through advanced administration. And as Max Faget said to me this morning, we not only planned to use the theoretical values worked out over 250 years ago by Newton and Kepler, the laws of motion, and the laws of thermodynamics worked out over 200 years ago, to build machines that could prove these theoretical foundations correct for orbital dynamics and orbital flight, but also how to change it and then how to check the changes on the ground, so we had a double check both from the men in space and on the ground. So with that indication of the significance, I should like to turn now to Mr. Lowe to introduce our astronauts and others involved.
Thank you,
George
Mr.
Lowe.
Webb. Earlier this morning at the award ceremony, I stated that this has been a fabulous year for Gemini and the manned spaceflight program. If you'll think back, just 1 year ago today, we had not yet launched Gemini 2, which was the unmanned spacecraft qualification flight. 1 year ago also, we made a commitment to you, Mr. Webb, and to the Congress to do our best to launch 4 Gemini missions in 1965. This commitment, of course, was met and exceeded. In 1965, 6 missions were flown. 5 of these were manned. In 1965 also, 10 men orbited the Earth for a total of 1,300 hours and more than 22 million miles. And if you'll think of that number, 22 million miles, that's nearly 100 times the distance from here to the moon. And in 1965, long-duration flight was achieved in steps of 4, 8, and 14 days. Also in 1965, self-propelled extravehicular maneuvers were conducted, and precision spacecraft maneuvers culminating in rendezvous and in controlled re-entry were achieved. And finally, in 1965, a host of scientific, technological, and medical experiments was carried out in Gemini orbital flights. All of this adds up to a demonstration of the precision and the flexibility that spell out operational proficiency in manned spaceflight. Some of the members of the team which achieved this proficiency were honored here earlier this morning. I'd like to add my personal congratulations to them and to all others on the Gemini program. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Gemini 6 and 7 astronauts. Captain Walter M. Sherrar, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas A. Stafford, Colonel Frank A. Borman, and Captain James A. Lovell. Frank, do you want to start it off?
Yes, thank you, George. Well, first let me say that I'm glad that the theme all morning has been on the group and the team emphasis on this mission, because I think it's been evident to Jim and I from the very beginning that we've had wonderful support from every quarter. Of course, one of the dangers when you start to try to outline the people that have given you the support is the fact that you often forget or overlook someone, and many people use this as a reason for not thanking everyone. I think what I'd like to say is that when we use the term our flight, that we'd like to use our in its broadest sense, and we'd like to have everyone that was out on the Oilers for 2 weeks in the Pacific, or down to the people that are working the midnight shift in Martin and McDonald, realize that we're speaking for them when we say our. I also would like to acknowledge a particular group of people, our fellow astronauts, because we've gotten a tremendous amount of support and effort from them, and I think that any of the 20-some odd that there are now could have occupied any of these 4 seats and done as good or a better job than the 4 of us did. We had the opportunity for which we're very grateful. And I think we'd all like to introduce the most ardent supporters of our particular team, and that's our families. And I'd like my wife and 2 boys to stand up, if they would. And my mother and father also from Phoenix.
My wife, Marilyn, and 2 children stand up, please.
I'd like to introduce first my wife and son. Our daughter didn't think she could handle this long session this morning, please. And I'd also like to introduce my mother and father.
I'd like to introduce my wife and 2 daughters. I see the youngest one stayed around here.
Well, we thought that perhaps we would start then, but Jim and I would start out with a very short recounting of 14 days in space. And Tom and Wally are pretty long-winded, so we want to reserve some time for them in the latter part of the press conference. But we should remember that even the achievement of turning Gemini 7 around and launching on December the 4th was quite an achievement. We arrived at the Cape on November the 8th with a little over 3 weeks to prepare, and the preparation and the launch was so nominal that it's hardly worth spending any time on. I will say that both Jim and I felt that we could definitely notice ignition on the Titan. We felt liftoff, and we had a wonderful ride on the vehicle. We were both impressed with the extreme accuracy of the guidance. We have some instruments within the spacecraft that tell us exactly how far off we're getting from nominal launch trajectory, and these 2 attitude indicators, we call them, didn't vary a hair's breadth for the entire powered flight. After approximately 5 minutes and 37 seconds of powered flight, we experienced what we call SECO, or the second stage cutoff, and we then attempted to turn around and station keep with the second stage. Now, as you know, we launched at 14:30 or 2:30 in the afternoon Cape time, consequently, by the time we achieved insertion, orbital insertion, the sun was rather low on the horizon. And we we had some problem photographing the second stage because we were photographing it right into the sun. However, it does, even though it may not be some of the engineering film is not too good, the artistic value of it is great, and perhaps some of the people enjoy seeing it. So if we could, I'd like to show you the first sights that we saw after we were inserted. Now this film was taken at 6 frames per second. We're playing it back at 16 frames per second, so we'll have some disparity in the motions. You can see the bright sun, and there's the booster, the second stage booster. It was tumbling approximately 2 revolutions per minute, and it was translating due to the venting that you can see coming out right here. Joe Verlander, do you see that venting? Okay. The Martin people were wondering where it was venting, and I just wanted to show him that this is where it was. We went into platform mode and found that when we used the platform mode, we were north and lower than the booster, so we had to go out of our attitude hold mode, as we call it, and go back and manually control so we were on the booster. And here we come into the film that's of questionable engineering value, but I'm sure there must be some modern art in it somewhere. There's the booster. See the venting? We found that it was very easy to stay within 100 to 60 feet of the booster. Thanks to many discussions we'd had with Jim McDivitt and Ed White and the simulations that we'd had, we were very adequately prepared to station keep. And we stayed with the booster for approximately 22 minutes. Now you see the light. One of the things that we noticed about spaceflight, of course, is the abrupt changes in shadows and light. Your night and day come very swiftly. And here it is, still tumbling. We saw no evidence of physical damage. The booster looks like if we could have recovered it, we could have launched it again for Gemini 8. I think it remained in orbit approximately 4 days. The lights that you see flashing there are strobe lights that were put on. We had 4 strobe lights that enable us to watch the booster for approximately 3 revolutions. As a matter of fact, at the end of 3 revolutions, the booster was still venting. And it was quite an impressive sight when it was properly displayed. Now the next film that you see are the film that we took of a Polaris launch, and there it comes. This was quite an impressive sight. We saw the Polaris pop right out of the Atlantic at exactly the point it was supposed to be, and we were able to track it very well. I might add that this Polaris was fired by the submarine Benjamin Franklin. It was the first time they'd ever fired a Polaris, and they were able to do it at the exact second it was programmed. And now you see as it starts to fade in as it's silhouetted against the clouds. Well, after that much of the powered flight and the insertion, Jim and I settled down to approximately 2 weeks, and he'll describe the 2 weeks.
Thanks a lot, Frank. We have some slides attached to the end of the movies, which we'll go through just a typical revolution of 2 weeks. We went through 206 of them, and we just picked out a few of the slides of the pictures that we took. This is the Republic of Haiti, and if I can show it, right up here is the town of Port-au-Prince. It gives you some idea of the dimensions of cities and towns from our altitude of about, in the last 7 or 8 days, which is about 161 nautical miles. I'm going to push the button.
Yeah, where's the button? We've lost the button. Will you change the slide, please? Here it is.
One of the most impressive sights that we saw, and one of the most areas that was always clear of clouds, was North Africa. And we spent many hours just observing the sand dunes and the beautiful tones and colors in North Africa. And we picked this one to show a section of Algeria showing the sand dunes. And it was unique in the fact that just prior to our arriving there, it rained, which was something unusual in North Africa. And close examination of the film will show water among the sand dunes and among this area in North Africa. Can we have the next slide, please?
I got the button.
Oh, yeah. Here's another section of the Aden Protectorate in the Arabian Peninsula. And of course, one of our jobs during the 2-week mission was to take photographs mainly for the geologists. And this shows some very interesting terrain features. And actually, you can see the water erosion that had occurred. But according to what I've just learned now, that in the olden days, the water had come down this way, but now it is draining in this manner. So we've had sort of an inversion of the terrain features here. This is the coastline of Somaliland. And it was unique because of the colors that we saw along the coast, these sort of orange sandy areas, and this is of course the Indian Ocean. This picture shows somewhat green nature of the terrain, but Frank and I have, in looking over all the countries many times, have discovered that the greens just don't come out when you're in the air, and most of our photographs show that it is predominantly a blue nature. This island is near Somaliland. It's called Socotra, and it's in the Indian Ocean. And we didn't look at land all the time. We were very fortunate in a 2-week mission to start out with a full moon and end up with practically no moon. And so we thought we'd get a little artistic license with our camera and take a shot of the full moon just as it was rising. This is a daylight photo, by the way, and it's rising right into the black sky.
That's it.
You have one more.
Is there one more? Oh, yeah.
This photograph is rather unique. It was taken just at twilight as we were coming across the Pacific Ocean into South America. The territory down here is Bolivia. These are the Andes Mountains. And the clouds are, of course, getting the orange tint of twilight, and the dark area back and through here is the night, or the terminator as we go into night darkness. Lights, please. Just some ideas of what we did during the 14 days. After station keeping, we did 4 adjust maneuvers with our thrusters. The first 2 were without a platform. One of the problems which we had was the lack of fuel and electrical power, and we had to make it last for 14 days. So we were very stingy on all the electrical power and fuel that we did have aboard, and we turned off the platform and the computer just as soon as we were finished station keeping. And we tried a technique of what we call burning on stars. The ground crew called up a star that we should aim the spacecraft at. We timed the burn and just kept the attitude looking at the star. Both of these burns worked out fairly decently, and both Frank and I feel that now that if we do lose platforms or computers, that we can make orbital adjust maneuvers by visual observation only. We made 2 more using the usual techniques of the platform and computer, and everything worked just as we had planned. About the second day, we tried something new. I took off my suit, and I felt rather cold and sort of naked in there for a little bit, thinking most of the time we have practiced with suits on, and normally spacecraft and suits sort of go together. But after about 2 hours of suitless operation, it became very comfortable. And I looked over at Frank, who was well suited up there, and I didn't want to tell him how nice it was because he looked so happy the way he was. This was one of the operational checks which we had tried to do. We felt in a long duration flights that suit operation with the heavy suit around you might be a hindrance to your welfare. And so we had attempted this, and I must say that the spacecraft performed very nicely. After a day or so, I didn't even look at the pressure gauge. It was very comfortable and very nice. As you know, towards the end of the mission, both of us became suitless, and we feel now that in long-range missions that this will probably be the technique people will use. One of our biggest problems, of course, was the same thing that everybody faces here on Earth: eating, sleeping, and housekeeping. And after the experience at GT5, we were very much worried that we'd sort of get pushed out of the spacecraft with all the debris that would accumulate. So we spent many hours prior to the flight finding out little spots and crevices in the spacecraft of where to pack things. And I really feel that it paid off. We would eat 3 meals a day, and Frank would very nicely pack everything in a small bag, and at the end of each day he would throw it behind the seat. And we managed to get 9 days' food behind those seats. I hate to look back there after the flight. One of the other things we did, which was rather new, since the mission was so long, and past crews have stated that they became increasingly tired due to the fact that one person would be on watch and the other person would be sleeping, and also communications between the ground and the spacecraft would keep the sleeping crew member awake. We decided to sleep simultaneously, and we worked on a Houston day. Our watches were set on Houston time, and we had a regular work day, had 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then at night we went to bed. We put up pads or filters in the windows and didn't look out, of course, and to us it was nighttime. We had absolutely no sensation of movement whatsoever. Our world was inside the spacecraft during our sleeping period. We even took some books along. Frank had one that I think was quite apropos. It was called Roughing It by Mark Twain. And actually, reading something that was entirely separated from space flight or spacecraft got our mind out of the spacecraft for that brief period of time. The experiments you've probably all heard about. We were quite busy for the full 14 days worth of experiments. The IR experiment with the booster and Polaris. We attempted the laser. I'm sorry to say we didn't get the communications through. We were getting a little short on fuel, and the weather was pretty bad during the last week. We had some interesting observations with the sextant, and we'd spend several hours just with our faces pressed up against the window at night with all the lights turned down low and watching the stars and the air glow. And we saw such things as the zodiacal light and a beautiful aurora down over Australia. At the time, Frank saw it first, and at the time we looked at it, we were drifting. And so we requested to the ground that could we not use some fuel on the next pass around to take some pictures of it. And they said, yes, go ahead. And by the time we got around again, approximately 90 minutes later, we couldn't find it. Do you have anything to add, Frank? No. I would like to talk about the rendezvous, but I'd be shot.
Well, let's see, the rendezvous, along about the 10th day, coming out of the... Actually, this Jim has hit very lightly, of course, on the 14 days. We might mention that we had some concern the night of the 12th day. As you know, we had a slight fuel cell problem. I really shouldn't say that because the fuel cells performed perfectly in that they provided electrical power for the whole 14 days. But there was a little concern in my mind, and I think in Jim's, about the end of the 12th day. We were very anxious to land near the WASP for more reasons than one, but we wanted to get near the prime recovery area, and of course this required a decision to go 24 hours at the end of the 13th night. We weren't interested in going 23 and a half hours or 19 hours or 12 hours, and I'll be frank to admit that in my own mind I did not feel that the fuel cells were going to last 24 more hours. And so I was prepared to come down at the end of the 13th day in order to land in the prime recovery area. And I think typical then of the wonderful support we got from the ground was a conference with Chris Kraft, and finally over the boat, the CSQ over out by Formosa, a testimonial, an advertisement, and a glowing description of how good our fuel cells were. And it did it did loads to reassure us, and I slept better that night than I did the other 13 nights in the whole flight. After the successful rendezvous, which Tom and Wally will discuss, we prepared for re-entry. As you know, we had lost the thrusters 3 and 4, or not lost them completely, but we'd lost partial authority on our 2 yaw right thrusters. But we found in aligning the platform for re-entry that there was still a sufficient authority to permit us to align the platform manually, which we did. We fired our retro rockets automatically. I shouldn't say we fired them. They were fired automatically approximately over Canton Island. And again, we had communications with Houston, remote through Canton. And as usual, throughout the entire 14 days, our communications were superior. Elliot C. came in and gave the countdown right on the money. And I must say that the retros were a little stronger than I had anticipated. It was quite a ride. I think the 6th crew mentioned the same thing. After being desensitized to G's for 14 days, we really felt like we were going back. I think John Glad said back to Hawaii. I thought I was going back to Japan or somewhere because they were very strong. But we then started a nominal re-entry. I discovered, though, that since this was fired, the retros were fired at night, we had very great difficulty in finding a horizon. And since we were anxious to enter heat shield first, we looked around, and I found that I could see a little bit better by taking off my hood, this new lightweight suit. And I think, Jim, we ought to mention here, Jim was instrumental in developing this lightweight suit. And although we were very anxious to get out of the suits entirely, I think the people that did this work did a superior job.
I believe if we didn't have the lightweight suit, that we probably could not get out of the suits. The regular suit is quite bulky. We have a big helmet, of course, as you all know. But the lightweight suit really helped us evaluate suit on, suit off configurations, and it was a good suit to have along.
That's right. Okay, then we finally picked up the horizon about 350,000 feet. We were given updates all the way along from Houston, and we then got what we call guidance initiate, where the 2 little indicators in our spacecraft, the same 2 that told us how good our boost was, started telling us where to steer for re-entry. And again, unfortunately, I wish I could make it vivid and exciting, because it really was. It was as the heat shield ablates and comes back, you get the impression that you're in an inferno. But the guidance was entirely nominal, and the spacecraft and the systems worked exactly as advertised. We came down to 100,000 feet. We noticed the same sensations that that had been debriefed many times by previous flight crews. Particularly, we had, I think, approximately the same re-entry that Gemini 4 had on the drogue. And we noticed the oscillations. I turned the RCS fuel back on to damp out the oscillations, and we found out that after we talked to Tom and Wally, they had exactly the same experience. So at 26,000 feet, we opened the snorkel. At 10,000 feet, we opened the main chute. It came out beautifully, the way we'd seen in movies and the way the other people had described. And we then went to landing attitude and hit very close to the planned landing area. This country is one of free speech, but I won't go any further than that. And all kidding aside, I think that both 6 and 7 hit within the accuracy of the re-entry guidance. It was exactly the way we'd planned, and I must say that it was entirely nominal. We'd flown the same thing at St. Louis and, of course, in our simulator many times. While we were still on the chute, in the landing attitude, I saw the recovery aircraft circling, and they called us. His call sign was Air Boss, and he was right there. As a matter of fact, I don't believe we'd been in the water more than 8 or 9 minutes, and we saw a face in Jim's window, and a Navy diver plugged in the interphone jack and said, "Merry Christmas." We were then airlifted out to the Wasp. We landed aboard, and I must say that the Navy was just great. They couldn't have been nicer to us. Of course, everyone's been this way. It was obvious by the way they picked us up and the precision that they accomplished their mission that they were professionals.
From an Air Force man, that's a great testimonial.
we then were submitted to the, or I should say, I guess, thrown to the doctors, and we recovered 10 hours later in fine shape. I think that before we get to the questions and answers, there are 2 or 3 things that I want to make clear. It's been reported that we felt like we were standing on our head after the initially being inserted into zero-G, and this perhaps was an unfortunate choice of words. Jim and I tried to relay to the ground common expressions like water droplets the size of grapes and so on, and when we said we felt like we were standing on our head, we meant we felt like we had an excess pressure in our head, perhaps a slightly higher blood pressure than normal. And Jim and I both noticed it, and it went away. How long, Jim? About a day?
About a day.
About a day, and after that was over, we noticed no other ill effects of, or no other effects of zero-G. And I must say that we were never at any time disoriented, confused. I don't think we even were angry with one another, were we?
No, amazing.
We won't keep the psychiatrists in business long this way.
I think this orientation is important because it has always been explained to us that sometimes people would get disoriented in space, but we found out that as far as we were concerned, under the rates that we had operated and the spacecraft drifted for quite a while during our entire flight, there was no such thing as disorientation. When we went to bed at night, our orientation concerned the spacecraft, and we didn't know which way the spacecraft was drifting. And in the daytime, we oriented ourselves visually with the horizon or the stars. The stars at night if we were looking out. So we had no worries about being disoriented in space.
Okay. And I think the one other item then that we ought to add is the fact that when we got back on the carrier, our legs were heavy, and if we had any deterioration at all in the flight, it was the fact that our legs weren't used for 2 weeks and they did feel stiff, and they were, I wouldn't say uncertain, but they were at least heavy. However, we came back to the Cape. As a matter of fact, the next morning we were able to ride an exerciser. Before the flight, I was able to go 16 minutes on it, and 18 hours after landing, I was able to go 14 minutes. So the muscle deterioration wasn't very bad. And when we got back to the Cape, we resumed our training and were able to run a mile the day we landed back at the Cape. And so, in my opinion, with proper crew comfort provisions, the people will have no difficulty going a month, 2 months, or as long as you want to in space. I think that the only unsuccessful part of our mission, before we take question and answers, I'd like to acknowledge also, I've overlooked, as I said, you often do, the superior support that we got from our backup crew of Ed White and Mike Collins. They were great. Of course, I know from having been a backup crew that sometimes it's a frustrating job, but these people performed in an excellent manner for the whole 6 months.
Kept us on our toes for a whole 6 months.
And they kept anything that we were reluctant to do, Ed would pop up and say, "We'll do it. We'll go." So they did a great job, and unfortunately they didn't go. I also would like to say that I evidently made some enemies in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm sorry, I think Atlanta's a great town, but I really wish Novus would have signed with Houston.
We'll take the question and answers. Please wait for the microphone. Gentleman on the front row.
Frank, could you have flown 14 days if you had not taken the suits off?
That's an interesting question, Jules. Of course, it's a subjective type question. And I'll say this. If we would have had the suit that had been used prior to our flight and not been able to remove it, I think our physiological effects would have been tremendous when we got out of the spacecraft. I'm not certain that we would have been able to bounce back the way we did, and it would have been then a matter of survival rather than a matter of operating efficiently in space. So, Jim?
I concur. I think motivation is there. We could have gone in just about any spacesuit for 14 days. But the matter of how well you operate in space is much better improved with the lightweight suit.
Our firm recommendation is that on any long duration flight, the redundancy be built into the spacecraft and the crews go suitless.
Jim, it's been reported from Berkeley that you began to feel faintness or began to gray out during the first tilt test. Would you describe this sensation to us in your own words, or describe it for yourself?
A living testimonial. I read that this morning. I'm alive. This is orthostatic hypotension, and it's present in, I think, just about everybody who came back from space. It's the same thing that you get when you lie in bed for 2 weeks and get up. The blood pools to the legs and starves the brain. This occurred in both of us. I had an interesting experiment. I had an M1 cuff, which was supposed to take care of this for 2 weeks. I faithfully wore this thing for 2 weeks, and it was very fortunate that the results occurred that I was in worse shape, so to speak, quote, than Frank was in recovery, because the M1 cuff proved out that it did not work. This is all it means is the fact that when crews come back from long-duration flights, there'll be a certain period of rehabilitation required, a day or so, to get the body back into functioning under 1G. As Frank told you, in 0G, it took us a little while to get used to the 0G. We felt that the body was functioning still under 1G and perhaps putting up more pressure in the head than was required. And after about a day, we got used to 0G. And after about a day or so, we got back used to 1G.
Would you comment on the laser test? Were you ever able to spot anything at all on the laser test?
Yes, over Hawaii, on one pass, we had it opened, and Frank did spot the laser. It's unfortunate that we weren't able to aim our laser and do the communication. We just didn't have the time. It took too long to acquire. I think that both Frank and I feel that had we had more opportunities weather-wise, fuel-wise, we would be able to complete this experiment.
Colonel Borman, was there any noticeable difference in your sleeping during the 4 days you wore the sensors and after they were removed or inactivated?
I know the gentleman is referring to a electroencephalogram sensor that 4 of them that I wore for the first part of the flight. Unfortunately, I hooked the harness on the parachute strap about the second day, and the sensors were ripped off. So I only wore them for 2 days, and no, they did not cause any noticeable discomfort in sleeping. They were a nuisance as far as getting hooked on things in the spacecraft.
Over here.
What did you photograph with your infrared color reversal film, or color shifted film?
We photographed mostly large green areas. We were trying to see just how well the greens would show up, and most of the areas were large jungle areas like the South American continent and things of this nature.
Well, let's take some questions from Berkeley if there are no more here.
Frank, there was some indication that you didn't sleep as well as Jim. Do you have any reason for that? And did you dream? And what was the nature of your dreams?
The fact is that I did not sleep as well as Jim did. Of course, you realize that we were confined, in a sense, to a sitting position for sleeping, and I guess I just don't have the facility for sleeping as well in a sitting position as Jim does. Many times I'd stir and wake up and see him completely sacked out over there, and I'd envy him. So I really don't have the reason for why I was not able to sleep as well. I will say that as the fatigue increased, I did get 2 or 3 nights of great sleep, but I was just not able to keep up a regular cycle. Another factor, I think, in my lack of sleeping was the experiment, the M1 experiment, which was certainly not objectionable from a noise standpoint, but it was there, and it was like sleeping and trying to go to sleep with a Big Ben or with a noisy alarm clock clicking away, and I was always aware of that just about the time I drift off to sleep. I might add, Julian, since we have the people in Berkeley there, and I know that's the convention of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, that Jim and I would like to make a testimonial. As a matter of fact, I think all 4 of us would. We didn't bring the Bibles, but I'm willing to swear right now that you cannot see stars in daylight. And this has been requested, and the people don't believe this, but unfortunately, you might pass the word out there in Berkeley that we couldn't see them.
What about the dream? I'd like to ask two questions. First, were you able to observe anything about the smear on Gemini 6 windows, or anything anywhere else on the surface of the spacecraft that might indicate whether the smear is coming from outside or from right around the edge of that window? And secondly, could you describe what, if anything, you were able to see of the Gemini 6 descent from orbit? That is, retrofire, how far you were able to see them at that separation?
As far as the smear on the window for 6 is concerned, it was rather difficult to see the actual smear. At times, when the light was just right, we could see a discoloration of the mirror. As a matter of fact, we have a photograph behind of 7, which I think you can almost see the change in color on the window. Unfortunately, you can't see it where you are. We did not see GT6's retrofire or reentry. That morning, when 6 was going to go back, we woke up and found out that our thrusters weren't working. 2 of our thrusters weren't working, unfortunately, and we were concerned with getting the spacecraft slowed down and stopped, and we weren't, at that time, we could not get the spacecraft in position to observe 6's retrofire.
Colonel Borman, to follow up Art Snyder's earlier question, did you in fact have some dreams during the 14 days? Jim McDivitt, for example, said that he dreamt at one time that he thought he had the mumps. Did you have anything like that?
No, I've already had the mumps, and I don't dream on Earth, and I didn't dream in space. I'll take that back. Night before last, I woke up and thought I was back in the spacecraft, but fortunately, I looked over and it wasn't Jim. I must say I slept much better than unfortunately, I had no dreams for 14 days.
To both astronauts, what was your first reaction when you realized you'd successfully carried off this rendezvous?
I can only talk for myself. Looking at it from a passive point of view, I think Frank and I expressed the same feeling. When we saw it was nighttime, just becoming light, we were face down and coming out of the murky blackness of the dark clouds, this little pinpoint of light. The sun was just coming up, and it was not illuminating the ground yet, but on the adapter of 6, we could see this illumination. And as it got closer and closer, it became a half moon, and it just like it was on rails. And at about a half mile, we could see the thrusters firing like light hazes of something like a water hose coming out. And just in front of us, without moving, it stopped. Fantastic.
I think that's true. I think that Wally and Tom did such a fine job, and of course they're going to discuss the rendezvous, so I won't dwell on it. But I might just add that it again seemed to be just old hat. We didn't have much fuel, and so after we had our opportunity to station keep on them for a very brief time, we went back on our business, and they were out flying around, taking pictures, doing things, and we were sitting in there eating and not even paying any attention to where they were.
Colonel Borman, whatever happened to the contents of that urine sample bag that Chuck Berry said sorry about, that, Chief?
I didn't hear the question, did you?
Good answer.
It was captured in a towel and stowed.
You mentioned briefly during reentry that you took off your hood for better vision of the horizon. Did you both remove your hoods? For how long a period did you have the hood off? And how significant do you consider the fact that you were able to capture the horizon without the hood in terms of future flights?
I was the only one that this is Frank Borman. I was the only one that removed the hood. Jim has a little longer torso, and he was able to see had a better upward vision than I did. I think that this has no significance for future flights. This suit was developed in a period of about 3.5 months for us by people in our own crew systems division and the David Clark Company, and they did a superior job. Elton Tucker and Company, they came through with with great work. But one of the problems that we had was with the visor, and unfortunately my upward visibility was restricted. We knew this before flight, and we flew with it anyway, and I felt that I could see better in an upward manner. And of course, when you re-enter, you're on your back, so you look up to see the ground. And I had so much confidence in the spacecraft by then that the last thing in the world I was worrying about was the cabin pressure.
Of all the things you could not take into space with you, which did you miss most?
Frank has done such a superior job before. I'll let him continue with this one.
I think this is the point where you say I refuse to answer on Gracid. Gee, I don't really know. I think if we could have changed anything, what we both would have preferred was a clear window.
That's right. The window situation was bad during the 14 days.
Jules, you have one more question for this group.
Frank, you and Jim had suits off for all 14 days. I know this is necessarily a subjective observation, but based on what Chuck Berry has said, you and he had adapted so well to the whole flight. How long do you two think you could have gone on if you had suits off and enough food and enough consumables aboard?
Well, I'll let Jim, we'll both chime in on this one, but I think that the spacecraft, when we shut down, was capable of flying for at least 6 to 8 more days. We had as you know, the people had done a fantastic job on insulating our tanks for the hydrogen and oxygen, and we shut down with at least 30%. We were almost out of ohms fuel, which meant we would have had to drift for 6 to 8 more days. I felt that really, if the situation demanded it, we could have easily gone that much longer in this capsule, although I wouldn't recommend. I think that we're going to have to provide in future spacecraft the crew comforts so that it would become a survival situation, Jules. You have to be able to function. And I think that the Navy found this in the Polaris submarines, that you have to provide the crew comforts so that people can not only just stay up there, which really doesn't prove much, but can function up there.
I think that there probably is no limit to the length of time people can stay under zero-G conditions without suits, providing you give them the proper spacecraft and include proper conditioning of the body at the same time. You need volume to live. 14 days in Gemini with this volume is just about the maximum that you can hope to get. You'll need bigger spacecraft to last longer.
All right, one more.
Mr. Webb, your group has done some very spectacular but also very costly things here. As President Johnson wrestles with next year's budget, he's looking for money to fight the Vietnam War. How much of a donation could NASA make to this very down-to-earth project?
Well, I would like to observe that the 10-year program that was planned was to cost 2/3 of 1 year's military budget over the 10 years. And the difference between our position in 1961, which I referred to earlier this morning in our award ceremony, when the Russians had flown Gagarin and we did not know what men could do in space, and our position today is worth every cent that we have spent, because we know now what can be done and what cannot be done, and we don't have to guess at the problems of understanding the space environment and operating there, both manned and unmanned. Now, with respect to Vietnam, my own view is that what these men on this team, and it's not my team, you said your team, I'm just one member of this team, what our team has done is to show the world that we can operate men and machines together very, very efficiently, and not only remain up 14 days, but make the rendezvous within a very short time interval from what we anticipated on the ground. This means that the world sees a nation of great capability and doesn't have to take somebody's opinion for it, but sees it itself. And my view is that this makes everything we do with respect to Vietnam, it makes every thought that many hundreds of millions of people around the world have about the future of the world work in our favor. And I think this is far more important than any direct financial contribution from this program. We're in the program deeply. We have had something like $22 billion appropriated to it, and we'll be within the last 20% of the requirements for the 10-year program with another year's budget. So I would say that the greatest contribution we can make to Vietnam is to succeed in these next Gemini flights. And if there's any doubt about whether we're going to make them or not, I'd like to say now we are going to make them, and we're going to learn everything we need from them. The funds are there already appropriated for that. There will be funds to go forward with the Apollo program on a timetable that will accomplish the missions we've set out within this 10-year program. At the same time, having been since 1916 the agency of this government working with aeronautics and the use of the air, and since 1958 the agency working with the ability to operate in space, we are making very large contributions from the funds appropriated to us to the total power position of this country. Every airplane that flies in Vietnam bears the NASA and NACA imprint in the efficiency with which it operates. And every pilot there bears the capability that has been built into his machines and his training from the work we've done with our military services.
Let's move into the Gemini 6 mission. And Wally, do you want to start?
It's very difficult to find a place to start to describe this mission. We had 3 starts, so maybe we'll just make one start here. Our first attempt, of course, was to rendezvous with the Atlas Agena, and then we had our Sunday off at the Cape and determined that wasn't the day to go. And we finally made it on the 15th of December on a Wednesday. I might add, this may seem like in jest, but this recovery from the 2 problems we had surely must indicate to all of you the tremendous design capability that was built into Gemini, into the checkout of the Gemini, into the booster, and the professional team that's been working with these spacecraft. The fact that they have responded to the knowledge that was gained from all of the previous flights. The fact that the system was designed well enough to respond to this rapid turnaround. I would like to pay a tribute first to one we've lost, Dr. Hugh Dryden, who led us on some of these paths. We've lost a man who helped us in developing man's capability, at least checking man's capability as we progressed, and that was Dr. Randy Lovell. To build the Gemini, to design it, to grab the pieces of paper, to draw lines, I definitely want to recognize one of our leaders in this organization at MSC, that's Jim Chamberlain. In addition, I want to recognize Walter Burke from McDonnell at St. Louis. These 2 men sat down and put those pieces of paper together that all of us have had so much success with since Gemini's been built. To get to liftoff, we did have one, and I asked Frank Carey at the Cape to hold that tail plug for us until we got back. And again, I can only say exactly as Frank did on his spacecraft. It was an ideal boosted flight. Typically, we train to a situation that's more difficult than the actual flight. And I didn't realize that we'd even trained to observe the platform and the guidance needles respond as neatly as they did on this flight. On the second stage, when we staged, we noticed a very large orange flame with a brownish black edging to it that enveloped the spacecraft, and then of course we flew through this. This was the event of staging. This, we have concluded, and I think Tom should best describe it, is the source of the obscuration or smoky cloud. I'd rather not use the word smudge, that's incorrect. It is a thin layer, a smoke residue layer, that appears on the windows. And I think Tom can describe to you people at Berkeley, as well as to all of you, what this effect was.
I was sitting on the right side of the spacecraft, and as we progressed into orbit, it would be in this fashion. I would naturally see the horizon first, and at approximately 2 minutes I could see the Atlantic Ocean coming up, and noticed how beautiful these string of cumulus clouds were going down the ocean on the Atlantic range, and also how pure they were in whiteness. And I just glanced out of the spacecraft for a second, since I was monitoring the computer and attitude indications on my indicators. At the event of staging, this flash was really fantastic. It started from the back corner. It was a yellowish orange phenomena. It progressed around to within 30 degrees of the longitudinal axis. At the edge of it was a brownish black smudge, as well as described, and just in 1 second we flew right through the whole phenomena. And kind of blink your eyes, I went right back to watch guidance initiate, and I came back to the same set of cumulus clouds on the Atlantic Ocean, and at that time the clouds did not look near as pure and white as they did before. So we've got 2 data points there, one prior to staging and one after staging. And the mixture, well, let me say the covering on the window is somewhat of a homogeneous mixture, like it's practically baked on there, and it definitely was thicker at the top than it was at the bottom, which you could expect with the spacecraft going into orbit this way. The top of the windows are near the outside of the envelope that would be formed with this fireball. So I think from talking at the time, right after we got in orbit, and also discussing this with Jim and Frank, all 4 of us are the conclusion that the smoke that we have on the windscreens came from the staging event.
I think we can continue on into orbit from there. The one point we should make, though, I believe, is the question was asked from Berkeley about whether we could see stars, actually I guess Frank volunteered that we could not see stars in daylight, and I gather people are thinking, well, maybe it was this smoke on the window that caused the problem. If there are no sun lines or oblique sunlight over the window panes, we can see the Milky Way, and that is a very low order of magnitude of star. We could see the sword hanging from Orion's belt, which is about a 6th or 7th magnitude star. So it is only when the sunlight is on the window that we have obscuration. Otherwise, we can see quite a few stars. In fact, I would say we saw many more stars than we saw out of the Mercury window on previous flights. Continuing into orbit, the booster acted perfectly. We had SECO at about 5 + 38 to 5 + 39. We performed our usual separation technique and immediately continued in the small end forward position. We didn't phase in to look at our booster. We were up there looking for 7, so we let it fall behind and charged on out after 7, naturally inquiring over the Canaries how far ahead they were. As we progressed during the mission, we thought we were running one of the best simulated net simulations we'd ever had. The ground controllers, the predictions, the equations, all of the numbers that have been generated for over 2 years were falling into place. The burns that we made to adjust our orbit, to change our catch-up rate, to raise our perigee were almost classic. They were so pure. And our updates were exactly as we would hope they would be. The data came to us very nicely. Unfortunately, it turned out our transmissions weren't as crisp. We could receive everything from the ground. The greatest delight, I suspect, both Tom and I had was when we made our tweak burn. To describe what this tweak burn is, we were making burns on the order of 40 or 50 feet per second to adjust the various phases of the orbit. And at the termination of the major velocity burn, we would have residuals or little bits of velocity to clean out in all three axes. These might amount to 0.3 of a foot per second. On one occasion, one was about 0.7 of a foot per second. And we made minute little burns to bring these velocities towards zero, which was the remaining velocity. And then after all this wrestling, the final phase adjust or height adjust came up from the ground. You have a 0.8 foot per second burn to make. As we progressed through the various maneuvers to affect a point in space which we describe as the NSR, this is the co-elliptic burn, we realized that we had been working with a very professional team who had fed us all of the good information that we needed, that we could do no mission as Rendezvous is described without. This is part of the mission where the ground has to put us in the right hole. They put us through the insertion window for the right orbit. The timing was exquisite. They put us into the circularization burn exactly the same way. Basically, it's almost like going into orbit all over again. I should like to back off from the circularization burn and let Tom pick up where the right seat gets kind of hot, running with radar and the computer. I think this is probably the mission where man's ingenuity in developing computers has really come to bear. The fact there were so many computer complexes involved. Computers running in real time to tell us where a star was that Frank and Jim used for pointing for their burns. Computers that told them what velocity to burn. And then we had our onboard computer that we finally had to rely upon.
Well, it was really a great experience to see the interface of the ground and the onboard capabilities work and the way that the data would flow. And needless to say, when we first turned on the radar set at the program time, Wally and I were both a little anxious to see the green lock-on light go steady, and it didn't. So right away I said, well, here's what I've been trained for. In other words, to go through all the backup modes and make lots of computations. We did get a real positive lock-on in excess of 230 miles, and from 230 miles down to 60 feet, that radar set performed beautifully. It told us exactly when we went from 120 feet down to 60 feet. It told us when we went from 235 miles down to 234.5 miles. And we'd worked out a series of procedures. In fact, these procedures had taken nearly a whole year in development. And this was a case, we'd say we'd lose the radar, or if we'd lose a computer, or we'd lose the platform, what could man do with some information from the ground to completely affect Rendezvous in the given situation that we had? Well, we had some very meager starts, and we had some great help. And I'd like to recognize about 3 individuals who helped us in the development of this. There's Dean Grimm from the Flight Crew Support Division, Buzz Aldrin from the astronaut group, and also Paul Kramer from the Flight Crew Support Division. We also had some McDonnell help on this too, but it was a great team effort in developing these procedures and techniques. And when Wally said how busy I was, in fact, I can say that I never saw the United States or South America on this flight. Part of it was due to clouds, but for the first 4 orbits, I probably looked out of the window maybe a maximum of 15 minutes. And so I was, say, a combination bookkeeper and computer there for a while. I don't think this much data will need to be recorded on future flights, but since this was the first rendezvous, we wanted to get everything documented. And again, when the radar locked on, we started taking data points, and I made my first 3 data points and transmitted them down to the ground. It was the best simulation we'd ever had, because for the nominal trajectory, I was within a 1 pencil mark of where the purest trajectory could ever have. And so, Chris, I want to say thanks again to your group. It was really a great vector. We proceeded on in there, and in the meanwhile, we had our own tremendous team cooperation, Wally and myself, calling out ranges. Wally was tracking on the target while I was interrogating the computer and also analyzing the radar data. And we finally came to the real key point, which is when you transfer from 15 miles below your target orbital altitude up. And it's a real critical situation. And again, I think this brings out the point that I think we've progressed a great deal towards our goal of the lunar orbit rendezvous. The Mission Control Center sent us up a vector. The onboard computer gave us a vector. I computed a vector, and also I had another vector that I computed just from the target centered coordinate plot. And all 3 agreed, and in fact we had one slight anomaly. This I can say that the IBM computer required in excess of 13 minutes for its solution. My solution was in only 200 seconds, but the other one took probably about 3 or 4 seconds from what Wally and I had done with the target-centered coordinate plot. So here again we had these 4 solutions, and they all agreed very well. And one thing, again, to get back to the wonderful support that the flight controllers did, they gave us an initial vector that appeared to be possibly a little bit early to us. And just as we passed over Rio de Janeiro, we got another vector, and as far as the time to initiate this burn, which is approximately 32 feet per second towards the target, and their computation was approximately 4 seconds off from my computation. So I guess that's good enough for government work, Chris. Say I was like the proverbial left-handed paper hanger in there, taking data and making plots, and again coordinating back and forth with Wally. And he'll go into some parts about aligning the platform, but we couldn't get a backup data solution for the first mid-course. After we make this transfer up, we'll normally make 2 mid-courses for a closed-loop solution, and we aligned the platform, so I didn't get a chance to make a backup, but from the target-centered coordinate plot, I leaned over and said, Wally, I said, the first one is going to be up and forward about 5 or 6 feet per second each direction, just from the plot. And the computer coughed up the solution 7 feet forward, 7 up. So we were pretty close on that one. On the next one, we did get a backup solution, and it agreed right with the computer. And all the time, Wally was tracking the target and on the radar needles, and I think it was really great, the coordination we had there. Of course, I think we were probably hyper-trained by the time we finally got around to the mission. And again, I think this brings up a great point, that man can do a tremendous job in space. I think this is probably the first computations we had as far as real orbital mechanics in space. How do you change your orbit? How do you really achieve a finite correction in trajectories? And the data we have from this, I'm sure it will be greatly improved, will enable us to use these same type of procedures when we have our lunar missions. And right now I'd like to have Wally talk about some of the piloting tasks and the interface we had back and forth.
The rendezvous maneuver had been developed for a long time. The application of the rendezvous maneuver is what took most of our time, and the 3 gentlemen that Tom gave tribute to were the ones who helped us bring this down to what we might call a pilot-engineer philosophy from the theoretical scientific approach. And this was quite a challenge for us. We had to work within the confines of the equipment we had and work with the amount of time we had to perform the mission. This was quite a problem when we first picked up the assignment. We didn't know where to really get the right equipment to simulate this. We first started with a device called a hybrid simulator at St. Louis, and ultimately the Gemini mission simulator, we have 2 versions of them, almost identical, one here at Houston and one at the Cape, came on the line. And we devoted a tremendous amount of time on these pieces of equipment. Ultimately added to this simulator was an optical display that gave us a star pattern, a target vehicle. Of course, we were training for the Agena, but unfortunately this couldn't be changed to look like Gemini 7, so we have accused 7 of being a target vehicle too often. Well, actually, we had a major intent, and that was to go up and see if their beards were really as long as they said they were. And also, of course, to check on that strap that Jim Lovell was complaining about. As we learned how to do this maneuver and perfected the techniques, smoothed them out to where the man-made computer and the man computer in that right seat could apply all this data as I tracked the target, we were checking other important facets of space flight. For example, how far away can you see an object? What can you do to improve the visibility of this object? On the Agena, we had installed 2 acquisition lights, which were very bright strobe-like lights that finally are brighter than the ones we're facing right now, about the only ones I know of. But unfortunately, they're not bright enough. The first time we saw spacecraft 7 was at 54 miles slant range. They were illuminated by reflected sunlight. We saw them for a balance of about 12 minutes and lost them at about 30 miles. Fortunately, this time span was the exact time span we needed for onboard computations in case we had lost either the radar, the computer, or the platform. And we could have made enough onboard computations to effect this transfer burn that Tom has just described. This was quite exquisite timing by the trajectory analysis personnel and real-time data plotting for us, Chris, that gave us this opportunity. We actually lost the target visibly before we made the transfer burn, but the computations were performed prior to it. Subsequent to the transfer burn, approximately 4 minutes after, we barely saw a glimmering bit of light from spacecraft 7. This is now in the dark side. We, at a period of 5 minutes after the transfer burn, elected to realign the platform. This is the guidance table, the reference platform of the spacecraft, from which you can learn, or from which you can base pointing angles to the target. We aligned for approximately 4 minutes, came back up to a pitch angle of about 45 degrees. The radar had maintained lock-on continually during this period, even though we had pitched down as much as 45 degrees. We reacquired the target by the radar presentation. The needles indicate elevation and azimuth. When they null, indicating much as a plus or an ILS presentation, as many pilots would recognize it, we were back on target. At that point, we did see spacecraft 7 with their light. This is about 22 to 23 miles. From then on, we could see spacecraft 7 all the way into intercept. The light we used was called the docking light. It was installed on 7 and on 6 to illuminate another object in space, such as the Agena or the booster in Frank's case. I think this is another time to indicate how the mission was easy for us. Frank and Jim were piloting their spacecraft and optimizing the reflected radar pattern. They had a transponder on the nose of their spacecraft, which is a required component of the radar system. We have the same type of antenna on the Agena. With their pointing the same point that we were faced on, in other words, forming a straight line between the two vehicles, continually they gave us the capability of running this radar run all the way through. After the second mid-course correction had been computed by the onboard system, Tom and I started getting to work in earnest. At this point, the computer has done its job. We're still about 3.5 to 4 miles away from the target. And we must then observe with those eyeballs that we have all been wearing these years the motion of the target in relation to the star field, the motion of the target in relation to the platform. The platform is displayed to us as an 8-ball, an attitude horizon ball. If any motion develops, we must immediately remove it. Continually during this period of time, Tom was calling out the pitch angle, the angle between our horizontal axis and the spacecraft 7, and the range, so that I could continually have an opportunity to assess where we were progressing on this transfer curve, the polar coordinate plot. And Tom was making plotted points on this plot as well to indicate how we were progressing along this nominal path. I think at this point it might be worthwhile for Tom to describe how much he saw, and then I'll come back and fly the rest of the way.
Well, I finally got one glance out of the window at approximately 13 miles, and then later on, after we finished with the computer and we were making our own final corrections up there, I would get more glances out, and this time I could see the docking light, and it was overshadowing the two blue strobe lights that were flashing. It was a very beautiful sight, and the stars were up there. And naturally, I was not as dark adapted as Wally was at this time, since I was in and out of the cockpit making the plots. But it was a real great feeling after about nearly a year's work to suddenly see our goal coming in this close and reading out the range of 2 miles decreasing. And then particularly at the end, the lighting condition is what we'd planned on all along, where we would actually swing out and pass a terminator and have the sun behind us, and we could see that this reflected sunlight would be on the white adapter of spacecraft 7, and it was really a beautiful sight to see how it grew as a half moon coming towards us. and then I was back in the cockpit calling ranges and theta. So really my view of it was very short, and Wally can probably give you the best view of it.
As we approached Gemini 7 and the first point of range where we had to take over in the cockpit completely and observe 7 as well, it's about 3 miles. And somebody from another place said, when you come within 3 miles, you've rendezvoused. That's when we were really shattered. We said, we're getting in there. From here on, the job really starts. And if anybody thinks they've pulled a rendezvous off at 3 miles, have fun. This is when we started doing our work. I don't think rendezvous is over until you are stopped, completely stopped, with no relative motion between the two vehicles at a range of approximately 120 feet. That's rendezvous. From there on, it's station keeping. That's when you can go back and play the game of driving a car, or driving an airplane, or pushing a skateboard. It's about that simple. As we progressed in toward Gemini 7, using the docking light as our target, we finally came into a range of about 700 feet, and that is when I lost respect for the lights that are illuminating us now. This sunlight on 7 was absolutely the brightest thing I've ever seen in my life. My eyes hurt. It was a Klieg light carbon arc lamp completely saturating my eyeballs. They were, of course, dilated due to the dark adaptation for approximately 30 minutes. Then immediately, without any hesitation, boom, this light comes on. Well, we even then managed to have a little bit of a giggly chuckle saying, I guess we're here. And from there on, it was a case of maintaining very small rates as we closed, till finally we were, as Tom was quoted at least saying, at 120 feet sitting. His statement really was 120 feet steady. And this was our real proud moment. As we continued from this point, we were almost directly below spacecraft 7. We eased up to what we call the SEF attitude. I might play the game as all pilots do, with models instead of hands at least. If you can be 7, I'll be 6. Is that right? Why don't you get up there? Yeah. As we kept working into the rendezvous, the two spacecraft were oriented, pointing toward each other. 7 with their transponder and 6 with the radar. And we were head down as we came into the final phase and stopped at 120 feet. This isn't a very good scale distance. And then finally eased on down just directly below them, and then came up into an attitude where 7 was leading us in orbit in the attitude we call BEF, which is blunt end forward, and we were in the attitude of SEF, or small end forward. And this is the nose-to-nose routine, and as a result of this, we got our complete confidence up and did close to about 1 foot in this position. Later, in an in-plane, an out-of-plane fly-around, Tom was flying as well. He closed to within about 1 foot. I think at this time it would be appropriate to show you some movies that were both taken by spacecraft 7 and by spacecraft 6. And it starts out with the fun part that 7 had. We were a little too busy to run our movie cameras, and fortunately they ran theirs. Oh, yeah. As we're closing in here, you can see the bright light that we are emanating. This is spacecraft 6. You can see the thruster activity. Jim Lovell tells me that he had his aperture set so that he could capture the thruster pictures, which is the first of these we've ever seen in any space mission. Now you can see we're coming almost directly below them, and we'll stop the motion. You can see the Earth traversing beneath us. And there we have one of those straps as well. Now Jim is settling in with another light value, and you can see the bright reflected light off the adapter. The wiggling device off to the side there is the horizon scanner. This aura that emanates from all of these pictures is not from the spacecraft that's being photographed. It's a reflection of the bright light on the cloudy window of the photographing spacecraft. There's some activity in there. I'm not sure what we're doing, but we were trying to regroup, I'm sure. We did notice when we were quite close that the heat of insertion into orbit was quite high and caused a burning of the paint on the United States flags. This is still some of the photography from spacecraft 7 of 6. Jim, am I correct that you shot these at 6 frames per second?
Yes.
These pictures were shot at 6 frames per second, and you'll notice a slight spottiness or jerkiness. The frames were filled in to be projected at a higher velocity. Now we are backing away from 7. This is our separation maneuver of 9 feet per second. I think this is one of the most dramatic strips of this whole flight. You'll see the spacecraft 6 go over the horizon into what amounts to a sunset. There should be a corny line there. I'd rather not use one. The half moon that you see there on their side, the sun is to the south of us. We have a picture similar to this where the half moon is on the other side. We're taking a picture of 7. We separated at about 9 feet per second. Now you can see the horizon coming into view, and you can see a spectacular sunset develop from this particular shot. Now, if you watch carefully, the spacecraft will just disappear. That is the terminator where the sun basically is eclipsed by the Earth and the sunlight cannot illuminate the spacecraft. I'm amazed that Jim continued taking pictures of sunsets. They must have seen quite a few by this time. You may notice the banding and the aerosol layers on the horizon. It's quite a spectacular thing. We can't photograph that as well as we're photographing this here, and I think I better have Jim explain what he's taking pictures of.
That's venting of liquid at night, otherwise known as a urine dump at twilight.
You might have noticed, if you looked very carefully, the constellation Orion. On this particular shot, you may notice that we have a shadow on spacecraft 7. We felt this was a new first. We eclipsed 7. Now you can see the debris that is in back of this is spacecraft 7. It is the primer cord that is used to contain a powder train to effect separation of one spacecraft from another. And when we heard they had this problem, we were anxious to go up to see it. When we heard from Frank that we had this problem, we were anxious to look at theirs to see what we really had. Now you can notice in this picture sunlight illuminating the cover of the adapter section. It's a fiberglass cover, and earthshine as well. Here's some more sunshine. You can see the scanner moving back and forth. That is the horizon scanner. Now you can see earth shine on one side, sunshine on the other, and the typical white cloud layer which gave us that much earth shine. And you'll see a terminator go across as we progress here. Notice how dark it is on one side. There's the horizon scanner I've been describing, oscillating back and forth. This is a sequence where Frank had described having an amount of water come through his suit inlet hose, and on advice from the ground started a 10 degree per second roll rate to clear out this problem. You can see some of the thrusters firing in this maneuver. We backed away for a while because we didn't know what type of motion would develop from this, and then we sneaked in a little bit later and took some more pictures of spacecraft 7. It was sort of interesting to note that an ice accumulation had built up at the water boiler outlet, and we were able to advise them in what attitude to take to melt this layer off. If you're curious about these plus signs on the window, these are orientation lines that are on the outer surface of the outer pane and the inner surface of the inner pane to give us roll and pitch reference in case we lose the platform. They are not reticles for the camera. Some of the equipment used for the experiments are visible here. This is one of the IR sensor heads that is deployed when in orbit. The water boiler is right there, still there.